In August of 1888, a threshing crew of 9 men rode into Elijah County, Kansas, to harvest wheat on an isolated farm. The farmer who hired them had paid double the standard rate. He said the crop was urgent. He said time was running out. By the third night, 6 of those men were dead, not from accident, not from illness. The wheat had taken them. When the county sheriff finally rode out to investigate, he found the farmhouse empty, the barn doors hanging open, and 400 acres of golden wheat standing tall and motionless in windless air. The threshing machine sat in the center of the field with its teeth clogged red. The crew was never found, but the wheat grew back the following spring, taller than any crop in Kansas history. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from tonight. It helps more than you know. My name is Samuel Coltrane. I am writing this account in the winter of 1931, 43 years after the events I will describe. I have kept silent for over 4 decades because no one would have believed me. I barely believe it myself. But the dreams have returned, and I am 81 years old, and my doctor says my lungs will not carry me through another spring. There are things that must be recorded before I die. There are warnings that must be given. What happened in Elijah County was not natural, and the evil that lived in those fields has not been destroyed. It has only been waiting. I was 22 years old in the summer of 1888. I'd spent 3 seasons working harvest crews across Nebraska and Kansas, following the wheat as it ripened from south to north. It was brutal work, but honest. The pay was good, the food was plentiful, and a young man with a strong back could save enough by autumn to survive the winter. I had joined a crew led by a man named Silas Drummond, a weathered foreman of perhaps 50 years, with hands like leather and eyes that had seen everything the plains could offer. He was fair and firm, and did not tolerate laziness or complaint. I trusted him completely. That trust would cost me more than I could have imagined. Our crew numbered 9 souls that August. There was Abel Finch, Drummond's second in command, a wiry man with scars on his forearms from a threshing accident years before. He spoke little, but worked harder than any 2 men combined. There were the Bauer brothers, Tom and Henry, thick-necked Germans from Nebraska who laughed constantly and argued about everything except when it was time to work. There was a boy we called Little Pete, no more than 16, who claimed to be 19 and fooled no one. He was quick and eager and desperate to prove himself. There was a Swede named Eric Lindgren who barely spoke English but understood the machinery better than anyone I ever met. There was Marcus Webb, a former cavalry soldier who had fought in the Apache campaigns and carried a revolver on his hip even in the fields. And there was a quiet man named Josiah Crane who joined our crew 2 days before the Elijah County job. He said he was from Missouri. He said he needed the work. He said very little else. We had finished a job near Hutchinson when Drummond received a letter that changed everything. A farmer in Elijah County, a man named Ezekiel Holloway, was offering double the standard rate for an immediate harvest. His letter was brief and urgent. The wheat was ready. The wheat would not wait. He needed men who could work fast and ask no questions. Drummond read the letter aloud to us in the boarding house where we were staying. Most of the crew laughed at the strange wording, but no one laughed at the pay. Double rate meant a man could earn in 1 week what normally took a month. We voted unanimously to take the job. The ride to Elijah County took 2 days by wagon. The landscape changed as we traveled, the gentle rolling hills giving way to flat expanses of wheat that stretched to every horizon. The sky above was pale and cloudless, bleached white by the August sun. The heat pressed down on us like a physical weight. The further we traveled, the fewer farms we passed. The roads grew rougher. The towns grew smaller. By the afternoon of the second day, we had not seen another soul for 6 hours. The Holloway farm appeared on the horizon just as the sun began its descent. I saw the wheat first, a vast golden sea that shimmered in the fading light. It was beautiful in a way that made my chest tighten. The stalks stood perfectly uniform, all the same height, all the same color, all bending in exactly the same direction, despite the fact that I could feel no wind on my face. Behind the wheat stood a weathered farmhouse of gray timber and a large barn, with doors that hung slightly open. A windmill rose beside the barn, its blades motionless in the still air. There were no animals visible, no chickens in the yard, no horses in the paddock, no dogs running to greet our wagon. The silence was absolute. Ezekiel Holloway emerged from the farmhouse as we pulled into the yard. He was a tall man, thin to the point of emaciation, with a long gray beard and eyes that seemed too large for his gaunt face. His clothes hung loose on his frame, as though he had lost considerable weight in a short time. He did not smile as he approached our wagon. He did not offer his hand. He simply stood and looked at each of us in turn, with an expression I could not read. Then he spoke in a voice that was low and dry, like wind moving through dead grass. He said the wheat was ready. He said we would begin at first light. He said we were to stay away from the fields after dark. Drummond asked why. Holloway's face went still for a moment, and something passed behind his eyes that made me feel cold, despite the lingering heat of the day. He said the wheat was not safe at night. He said the wheat had needs that we did not understand. He said we should do our work, take our pay, and leave as quickly as possible. Then he turned and walked back toward the farmhouse without another word. Through the window, I saw a woman's face watching us. She was pale and thin like her husband, and she did not move, even when I raised my hand in greeting. She simply watched with dark eyes that reflected nothing. We made camp in the barn that night. The interior was clean but empty, with no hay in the loft and no tools on the walls. The wooden beams showed strange marks, deep grooves cut into the timber at regular intervals, as though someone had been counting something over many years. Little Pete pointed them out and asked what they meant. Abel Finch told him to mind his own business and focus on getting sleep. But I saw Finch studying those marks late into the night, his scarred fingers tracing the grooves as his lips moved in silent calculation. I woke once before dawn to the sound of movement outside the barn. I crept to the door and peered through a gap in the boards. The wheat field stood silver in the moonlight, and the stalks were moving, not swaying, moving. They bent and straightened in patterns that rippled outward from the center of the field, like something was walking through them. But I saw no figure. I saw no shadow, just the wheat, moving in waves, pulsing like the slow breath of something vast and sleeping. I watched until the movement stopped. Then I returned to my bedroll and did not sleep again until the sun rose. We began work at sunrise. Holloway met us at the edge of the field with a rusted scythe in his hands and a look on his face that I now recognize as desperate hope. He explained that the threshing machine was already positioned in the northwest section where the wheat grew tallest. He said we should start there and work our way toward the farmhouse. He said we should never let the wheat close behind us. He said we should always keep a clear path to open ground. Drummond asked again why these precautions were necessary. Holloway stared at him for a long moment and said the wheat did not like to let go of what it held. The crew exchanged glances, but said nothing. Double Pay bought a lot of silence. We gathered our tools and walked into the field. The wheat was tall, taller than any crop I had ever seen. The stalks reached above my head and formed a golden canopy that blocked the sky. The air inside the field was thick and still, heavy with a smell I did not recognize. It was not the clean scent of ripe grain. It was something older, something organic, something that reminded me of the way a wound smells before it begins to heal. The ground beneath my boots was soft and dark, almost black, far richer than the pale Kansas soil I had worked all summer. I knelt and pressed my fingers into the earth. It was warm, not from the sun, warm from something beneath. We reached the threshing machine within an hour. It was an old model, a case machine from perhaps 20 years before, with a cylinder feeder and manual crank. Eric Lindgren circled it twice and pronounced it functional but poorly maintained. The teeth were dull and stained with something that might have been rust. The feeding tray showed deep scratches along its surface, long parallel gouges that did not look like normal wear. Marcus Webb ran his finger along one of the scratches and lifted it to his nose. He frowned and wiped his hand on his trousers without comment. We set to work. The Bauer brothers operated the threshing machine while the rest of us cut and gathered stalks. The rhythm of harvest is hypnotic when it goes well. A steady pattern of cut, gather, feed, repeat. For the first few hours, the work proceeded normally. The wheat fell beneath our scythes and piled in golden bundles. The machine hummed and rattled. The grain separated cleanly. But I noticed something strange as the morning progressed. The wheat we had cut did not stay cut. When I looked back at the rows we had cleared an hour before, the stalks had risen again, not fully grown, but risen, standing at half height where they had been flat on the ground. I pointed this out to Drummond. He stopped working and stared at the regrown stalks for a long moment. Then he told me to keep cutting and not look back. Little Pete was the first to notice the other thing. He had wandered further into the uncut wheat to retrieve a bundle he had dropped, and he came running back with his face pale and his eyes wide. He said there were bones in the wheat. He said he had tripped over a rib cage hidden in the stalks. Drummond and Abel Finch followed him back to the spot. I went too, though no one asked me to. The bones were there, just as Pete had described. A human rib cage, half buried in the black soil, with scraps of cloth still clinging to the curved white surfaces. Nearby lay a skull, partially crushed, with wheat stalks growing through the eye sockets. There were more bones scattered in a rough circle, femurs and vertebrae, and the small, delicate bones of hands and feet. They had been there for years, perhaps decades. The wheat had grown around them. The wheat had grown through them. Drummond told us to keep working. He said old farms often had forgotten graves. He said the bones were probably from a family burial plot that had been plowed over and planted. He said these things happened on the frontier. His voice was steady, but I saw his hands shaking as he gripped his scythe. We returned to the machine and resumed our work. No one spoke for the rest of the morning. At midday, Holloway's wife brought food to the edge of the field. She was thin like her husband, with the same dark eyes and the same unsettling stillness. She set the basket on the ground and retreated without speaking. The food was simple, bread and cheese and dried meat, but it tasted wrong. The bread had a faintly sweet flavor that reminded me of the smell in the field. The cheese was soft and gray instead of yellow. The meat was stringy and had an unfamiliar texture. I ate because I was hungry, but I noticed that Josiah Crane did not eat at all. He sat apart from the group and watched the wheat with an expression of intense concentration. When I asked him what was wrong, he said the wheat was watching us back. That afternoon, we lost Henry Bauer. He'd gone into the tall wheat to relieve himself and had not returned after 10 minutes. His brother Tom went looking for him and came back alone, his face ashen and his voice breaking. He said he had found Henry's boots standing upright in the soil, just the boots. The laces were still tied. The wheat around them was pressed flat in a wide circle as though something heavy had thrashed there. But there was no blood. There was no body. There was no sign of struggle except for those empty boots standing like a monument in the black earth. We searched for an hour. We called Henry's name until our throats were raw. The wheat absorbed our voices like cloth absorbs water. The sound did not carry. It simply stopped, swallowed by the golden stalks that surrounded us on every side. When the sun began to sink toward the horizon, Drummond ordered us out of the field. We retreated to the barn in grim silence. That night, Holloway came to us with lanterns and a warning. He said Henry was gone. He said the wheat had taken him. He said this happened every harvest, and there was nothing to be done except finish the work and leave before the wheat decided it wanted more. Tom Bower demanded to know what that meant. Holloway explained in that dry, dead voice of his. He said the wheat was not wheat. He said it was something older, something that had been growing in the soil since before his grandfather's grandfather had claimed this land. He said it needed blood to grow. He said it needed flesh to thrive. He said his family had fed it for 4 generations, and in return it had made them rich. But the wheat was always hungry. The wheat was never satisfied, and sometimes the wheat took more than it was given. Marcus Webb drew his revolver and pressed it against Holloway's forehead. He demanded to know where Henry was. Holloway did not flinch. He said Henry was everywhere now. He said Henry was in the stalks and in the soil, and in the grain that would be harvested tomorrow. He said we were welcome to leave, but the wheat had already learned our scent. He said it would be very difficult to reach the county road before nightfall, and the wheat was always hungry after dark. We held a council in the barn that night. Tom Bower wanted to leave immediately. He said he would take his chances on the road, wheat or no wheat. Marcus Webb agreed. He said he had fought Apache warriors and Mexican bandits, and whatever was in that field could not be worse. But Drummond shook his head. He pointed out that we were 6 miles from the nearest town, that the wagon could not travel fast in darkness, and that we had all seen the way the wheat moved at night. He said we should finish the job at first light, collect our pay, and leave while the sun was high. He said Holloway was clearly mad, and whatever had happened to Henry was likely an accident or an animal attack. He said panic would only make things worse. Abel Finch spoke for the first time since we had found the bones. He said he had been counting the marks on the barn beams. He said there were over 200 of them, carved in groups of 5 and 7 and 9. He said they were tallies. He said each mark represented a person. He said the Holloway family had been feeding the wheat for a very long time. When Tom Bower asked how Finch knew that, Finch lifted his scarred forearms and said he recognized the marks. He said his father had worked this farm 30 years ago. He said his father had never come home. The barn went silent. Finch continued in a flat voice that held no emotion. He said he had not recognized the name Holloway because his father had worked for a man named Crane. He said the original family had died out years ago, and new owners had taken over the land. He said the wheat did not care who fed it. He said the wheat only cared that it was fed. I looked at Josiah Crane, the quiet man who had joined our crew 2 days before the job. He met my gaze without expression. Then he stood and walked out of the barn into the darkness. No one tried to stop him. We did not sleep that night. We sat in a circle with our backs to each other and our weapons in our hands. The sounds from the field grew louder as the hours passed. Rustling, shifting, a low, rhythmic whisper that might have been wind but carried no breeze. Once, I heard what sounded like a human voice calling from deep within the wheat. It said a name I did not recognize. It said it over and over in a tone of desperate longing. Little Pete began to cry softly. Eric Lindgren murmured prayers in Swedish. Marcus Webb cocked his revolver and did not lower it until dawn. Josiah Crane did not return. When the sun rose, we found his clothes folded neatly at the edge of the field. His boots stood beside them, empty and upright, the laces still tied. There was no blood. There was no struggle. He had simply walked into the wheat and been consumed. I understood then that Crane had not joined our crew by accident. He had come home. The wheat had called him back, the way it called back every descendant of the families who had fed it. The debt passed down through blood. The hunger never forgot. Holloway appeared at the farmhouse door as we emerged from the barn. He looked even thinner than before, as though the night had drained something vital from his body. He said the wheat was pleased. He said 2 offerings in 2 days was generous. He said we should finish the harvest quickly now, while the wheat was satisfied and slow. He said we might all survive if we worked fast enough. The way he said might made my stomach turn. We worked like men possessed. The scythes rose and fell in desperate rhythm. The threshing machine roared without pause. We did not stop to eat. We did not stop to rest. We cut and gathered and fed the machine until our arms burned and our backs screamed for relief. The wheat fell in waves, and this time it did not rise again. The black soil drank the morning dew and steamed faintly in the growing heat. By noon, we had cleared nearly a third of the field. By mid-afternoon, we had reached the halfway point. Drummond pushed us harder. He said we could finish by nightfall if we did not slow down. He said we would be free of this cursed place before the stars appeared. Then little Pete cut his hand on the threshing machine. It was a small wound, a gash across his palm from a jagged piece of metal he had not seen. The blood flowed freely for a moment before he wrapped it in a strip of cloth torn from his shirt. He tried to continue working, but Drummond ordered him to rest. He said an infected cut could kill a man faster than any wheat field. He told Pete to sit at the edge of the cleared area and keep pressure on the wound. Pete obeyed reluctantly. He sat with his back to the standing wheat and watched us work. I was the one who noticed when the wheat behind Pete began to move. The stalks bent toward him, slowly and deliberately, like flowers turning toward the sun. I shouted a warning. Pete spun around just as the first stalks touched his injured hand. The wheat wrapped around his fingers with terrible speed, coiling and tightening, pulling him backward into the golden mass. He screamed once, a high, terrible sound that cut off abruptly as the stalks covered his mouth. I ran toward him, slashing with my scythe, cutting through stalks that grabbed at my arms and legs, but the wheat was faster. By the time I reached the spot where Pete had been sitting, there was nothing left but a dark stain on the soil and a single boot lying on its side. The wheat had drunk his blood. The wheat had taken him whole. 4 of us remained: Drummond, Finch, Webb, Tom Bauer, and myself. 5 men against 400 acres of hungry wheat. The sun had begun its descent toward the horizon, and we had cleared barely half the field. Drummond made a decision. He said we would not finish the harvest. He said we would make for the road immediately and take our chances in the open. He said anything was better than waiting for the wheat to take us one by one. We gathered what supplies we could carry and moved toward the farmhouse. The wagon was there, still hitched and ready. The horses stood motionless in their harnesses, their eyes wide and white-rimmed with terror. They had not moved since we arrived. They had not eaten or drunk or made a single sound. I touched one of them and felt cold flesh beneath the hide. The horse did not react. Its chest did not rise. Its heart did not beat. The horses had been dead for days, perhaps weeks. They stood only because something held them upright. They waited only because the wheat was not finished with them. Marcus Webb shot both horses in the head. The bodies did not fall. They simply stood there with new holes in their skulls, dead eyes staring at nothing. Webb emptied his revolver into them, and still they did not move. Drummond grabbed his arm and told him to stop wasting ammunition. We would have to walk. The road lay 6 miles to the east, through open prairie that should have offered no cover for anything to hide. But as we left the farmyard, I looked back at the wheat field and saw the stalks beginning to lean. The entire crop, hundreds of acres of golden grain, was tilting toward us like a crowd watching a spectacle. The stalks did not move. They did not sway. They simply pointed, all of them, in perfect alignment, following our progress across the cleared ground. We had covered perhaps a quarter mile when the wheat began to spread. The stalks at the edge of the field bent down to the soil and pushed forward, extending the boundary of the crop. New growth erupted from the black earth in their wake, young shoots that rose to full height in seconds. The wheat was not confined to the field. The wheat was wherever it wanted to be, and it wanted to be between us and the road. We ran. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs threatened to give out beneath us. The wheat grew faster than we could move, rising on all sides to form walls of golden stalks that blocked every direction except back toward the farmhouse. Drummond tried to cut through with his scythe, but the stalks he severed regrew before he could take a second swing. Finch used a torch made from a bundle of dry grass, and the fire caught for a moment before the wheat smothered it with green shoots that would not burn. The wheat was driving us back. The wheat was herding us toward the threshing machine. We stood in the clearing we had made that morning, surrounded on all sides by a wall of grain that rose 10 feet high and rustled with hungry anticipation. The threshing machine sat in the center of the cleared space, its iron teeth gleaming in the fading light. Holloway stood beside it. His wife stood beside him. Between them stood 3 children I had not seen before, a boy and 2 girls, all with the same dark eyes and the same terrible stillness. They had been hiding in the farmhouse all along. They had been waiting for this moment. Holloway spoke in that dry, dead voice. He said the harvest must be completed. He said the wheat required a certain number of souls each season, and we had not yet met the quota. He said his family had maintained the bargain for 4 generations, and they would not fail now. He said we could choose to walk into the wheat willingly, or we could be taken by force. He said the wheat preferred willing offerings. He said the wheat found fear to be bitter. Marcus Webb raised his revolver and shot Holloway in the chest. The farmer staggered but did not fall. Dark liquid seeped from the wound, too thick to be blood, too black to be anything human. Holloway looked down at the hole in his shirt and then looked up at Webb, something like pity in his eyes. He said his family had not been human for a very long time. He said the wheat had changed them, improved them, made them into perfect servants. He said we could become like them if we chose. He said the wheat was generous to those who served it well. The children moved first. They were fast, faster than anything their size should have been, and they struck with hands that ended in fingers like wooden stakes. Tom Bauer went down with a child's hand buried in his throat. His blood sprayed across the golden stalks, and the wheat leaned in to drink. Webb fired his remaining bullets into the children, but they did not slow. They swarmed over him and bore him to the ground, and the last sound he made was a gurgle of disbelief. Finch grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the threshing machine. He shoved me into the feeding tray and told me to stay down. Then he climbed into the operator's seat and engaged the mechanism. The machine roared to life, its iron teeth spinning with terrible speed. Finch screamed at Holloway's family to come and take him. He screamed that he would feed every one of them to the machine before he died, and then he threw himself forward into the teeth. The machine jammed. Finch's body clogged the mechanism with a grinding shriek of tortured metal. The children stopped their advance. The wheat fell still. In the sudden silence, I heard Finch's voice, weak and broken, telling me to run while the machine held. I climbed out of the feeding tray and ran toward the only gap in the wheat wall, a narrow space where the stalks had parted to watch the slaughter. I did not look back. I did not stop. I ran until the wheat was behind me and the open prairie stretched ahead and the sun had fully set. I ran through the night. The moon rose full and bright, casting silver light across the empty prairie, and I used that light to navigate toward what I hoped was the county road. Behind me, the wheat field glowed faintly on the horizon, a golden shimmer that pulsed like a heartbeat. I did not know if the wheat was following. I did not know if the wheat could cross open ground without soil to anchor it. I knew only that I had to keep moving, or I would die like the others. The road appeared near dawn, a rutted dirt track that led toward a town I could not see. I collapsed beside it and lay in the dust, too exhausted to move, too terrified to sleep. The sun rose slowly over the eastern horizon and warmed my frozen body. I waited until the light was strong before I stood and began walking. Every shadow made me flinch. Every rustle of grass made me spin with fists raised. But nothing came. The wheat had let me go. I reached the town of Miller's Crossing by mid-morning. It was a small settlement, perhaps 30 buildings clustered around a general store and a livery stable. The people who lived there looked at me with a mixture of concern and suspicion as I stumbled down the main street. I was covered in dirt and dried blood. My clothes were torn. My eyes, I am told, had the look of a man who had seen things beyond the boundaries of reason. A woman brought me water. A man asked where I had come from. When I spoke the name Elijah County, they all stepped back. When I mentioned the Holloway farm, they made signs against evil and refused to come near me. The sheriff arrived within the hour. He was a large man with a gray mustache and tired eyes that suggested he had heard stories like mine before. He took me to his office and gave me coffee, and listened without interruption as I described everything that had happened. When I finished, he sat in silence for a long moment. Then he opened a drawer in his desk and removed a thick folder filled with yellowed papers. He said the Holloway farm had been a problem for 60 years. He said crews went in and never came out. He said the county had tried to burn the fields twice, but the wheat would not catch fire. He said they had tried to plow it under, but the blades had shattered on roots that went too deep. He said the only solution was to let the farm alone and warn travelers to stay away. He said I was the first survivor he had ever met. I asked about Drummond. The sheriff shook his head. I asked about the others. The sheriff shook his head again. He said anyone who entered that field was gone, and gone meant forever. He said the wheat did not give back what it took. He said I should consider myself fortunate and never speak of this again. He said the world was not ready to know what lived in the heart of Kansas. He said some things were too old and too hungry to be understood. I left Miller's Crossing that same afternoon. I took a stage to Wichita and a train to St. Louis and another train to New York. I put as much distance between myself and Kansas as geography allowed. I changed my name. I found work in a factory. I married a woman who never asked about my past. I lived a quiet life in a city of brick and stone, where nothing grew except in carefully tended boxes on windowsills. But I never forgot, and I never stopped dreaming. The dreams always begin the same way. I am standing in the wheat field with the golden stalks rising around me. The sun is setting, the air is still, and the wheat begins to move, bending toward me, reaching for me with stalks that end in fingers of pale yellow grain. I try to run, but my feet sink into the black soil. I try to scream, but the wheat fills my mouth with its sweet and rotting taste. I wake before the stalks consume me completely. I wake with the sheets soaked in sweat and my heart pounding against my ribs. And sometimes, in those first confused moments between sleeping and waking, I can still hear the whisper of the wheat calling my name. I kept my silence for 43 years. I told no one what I had witnessed. I answered no questions about the scars on my arms from the wheat's embrace. I pretended to be a man without a past, a man born fully formed in the factories of New York. But the silence did not protect me. The wheat had taken something from me that night, something I did not realize was missing until decades later. It had taken my peace. It had taken my ability to trust the ground beneath my feet. It had taken my faith that the world made sense. In 1925, I received a letter that shattered what remained of my constructed life. It came from a lawyer in Kansas who had tracked me down through records I thought had been destroyed. The letter informed me that I was the sole heir to a property in Elijah County. The Holloway family had died out. The farm was mine. The wheat was waiting. I burned the letter and the envelope and the return address. I moved to a new apartment in a new borough under a new name. But the dreams grew worse. The whisper grew louder. And one night in 1927, I woke to find my hands covered in black soil that I could not explain. I had been sleepwalking. I had been digging in the small patch of garden behind my building. I had been planting seeds I did not remember acquiring. When I examined the seeds in the morning light, they were wheat kernels, pale and perfect, exactly like the grain we had harvested at the Holloway farm. I destroyed them. I salted the earth where I had planted them. I poured kerosene on the soil and set it alight. The fire burned for an hour and left nothing but sterile ash. But a week later, green shoots appeared in the blackened earth. The wheat was growing. The wheat was coming for me. I moved again. I moved to an apartment with no garden, no soil, no earth of any kind. I lived on the 5th floor of a concrete building and never touched the ground if I could help it. I took stairs instead of elevators because elevators went down, and down led to the earth, and the earth belonged to the wheat. I avoided parks and cemeteries and farms, and any place where growing things might find purchase. I lived like a prisoner in a cage of my own making, and still the wheat found ways. It appeared in cracks in the sidewalk, single stalks of golden grain growing where nothing should grow. It appeared in window boxes in my neighbors' apartments, replacing their flowers overnight with pale yellow stalks that bent toward my window. It appeared in my dreams every night, calling me home, promising rest, promising an end to running. The wheat was patient. The wheat was eternal. The wheat would never stop coming. I am writing this now because I know my time is short. My lungs are failing. My heart beats irregularly. The doctors say I have weeks at most, perhaps days, but I know the truth. The wheat does not want me to die in this hospital bed. The wheat wants me to come home, and I can feel the pull growing stronger with each passing hour. I can feel the soil calling me back to Kansas, back to Elijah County, back to the field where my crew died and the machine still waits with its teeth clogged red. Last night, a nurse brought me a vase of flowers. She said they were from an admirer who did not leave a name. The flowers were beautiful, bright and colorful, the kind that grow in gardens. But hidden among them was a single stalk of wheat, golden and perfect, with a ribbon tied around its stem. The ribbon bore a message in handwriting I recognized. It was Drummond's handwriting. It said, "Come home." It said, "We are waiting." It said, "The harvest is not complete." I understand now that the wheat did not let me escape. The wheat let me go so that I would spread its seeds. Every place I have lived, every garden I have touched, every patch of soil I have walked upon, now carries the wheat's contamination. I have been a carrier all these years, a vessel for spreading the hunger across the country. The wheat in Kansas was only the beginning. The wheat is everywhere now. The wheat is in every state and every city and every small town where I stop to rest on my decades of running. Look at the fields around you. Look at the grain that grows in your parks and your yards and the cracks in your sidewalks. The wheat is not wheat. It was never wheat. It is something older than human memory, something that grew in this soil before the first people walked upon it, something that learned long ago how to make us feed it. The pioneers did not discover it. They awakened it. And now it is everywhere, and it is hungry, and there is nowhere left to run. I can hear the wheat outside my window now. I can hear the stalks brushing against the glass, reaching for me through the concrete and the brick and the sterile hospital walls. The nurse has not returned. The doctors have stopped making rounds. The hallway outside my room is silent, except for a soft, rhythmic rustling that grows louder with each passing minute. I will not fight anymore. I am too old and too tired and too broken to resist what has been coming for 43 years. The wheat wants me. The wheat has always wanted me. And soon, the wheat will have me, just as it had Drummond and Finch and all the others who thought they could escape the harvest. Remember what I've told you. Remember the Holloway farm and the threshing machine and the black soil that drank blood. Remember that the wheat is hungry, and the wheat is patient, and the wheat never forgets. Look at the fields around you and ask yourself how long they have been growing. Ask yourself who planted them. Ask yourself what they have been feeding on. The door to my room is opening now. Something is coming in. I can hear the dry whisper of stalks dragging across the floor. I can smell the sweet decay of grain that has grown too long in dark soil. I can feel the pull in my chest, the longing to finally stop running and let the wheat take me home. The harvest is never complete. The wheat is always hungry, and now the wheat has come to collect what it is owed. Forgive me. I should have burned with the others. I should have fed myself to the machine rather than carry this curse across the country. But I was young and afraid, and I wanted to live. Now I understand that there are worse things than dying. There is living with the knowledge of what waits in the golden fields. There is running for decades from something that never tires. There is finally understanding that you were never really running at all. You were only spreading the seeds. The wheat is here. The wheat is everywhere. And the wheat is very, very hungry. Remember us. Remember what grew in Elijah County. And when you see the wheat bending in a field with no wind, know that it is already too late. The threshing has begun.